tantalizing glimpses of Egypt's lost glory first come to light in the wake of Napoleon Bonaparte's North African invasion of 1798. The rediscovery of this ancient civilization sparks off a love affair with Egypt that goes on to sweep the world. The early Egyptologists are above all trophy hunters, determined to make a name for themselves by hauling shiploads of Egyptian treasure to Europe. France, England, Italy and Germany compete furiously to gather the biggest and best examples of Egyptian art and culture. During the 19th century, a growing respect for Egyptian culture emerges. But this too rapidly becomes a matter of international competition. The nations of Europe vie furiously with each other over who will lead in preserving Egypt's treasure. Discover how a group of ambitious collectors turn from plunder to preservation as they embark on the quest for ancient Egypt. By the middle of the 19th century, France lays claim to the world's largest collection of Egyptian artifacts. They're housed at the Louvre in Paris, where the majority of serious scholarly work on ancient Egypt is being done. In 1847, the Louvre's Egyptian department gains its newest employee, 26-year-old Auguste Mariette. Largely self-taught, Mariette's dedication to his work quickly earns him the attention of his superiors. After only 3 years, he's picked for a mission to Cairo. His task to acquire a number of ancient manuscripts, ensuring France retains the finest Egyptian collection in the world. Acquiring Egyptian artifacts is a competitive business, engaged in by both rival museums and private collectors. The English are richer than the French, the Italians more ruthless, and the Germans more ambitious. Egyptology in the mid-19th century is a dangerous occupation, fraught with subterfuge, double-dealing, and outright theft. Mariette falls in love with Egypt, but his inexperience allows the precious manuscripts to slip through his fingers. He's convinced that his failure will embarrass the Louvre and cost him his job. But as he stares out towards the desert and the distant pyramids, he writes in his journal,
"The peaceful city stretched before me with the pyramids standing to the west. I was utterly absorbed. There, almost within reach of my hand, lay a whole world of tombs, inscriptions, and statues."
Determined to make the best use of what might be his only trip to Egypt, Mariette decides to visit the pyramids and a few temples before his money runs out. During his travels, he befriends a Bedouin tribe who tell fantastic stories of fabulous treasures, ancient tombs, and lost cities still buried under the desert sand. If he can prove that even one of these stories is true, Mariette is convinced he might still return to France a hero. Following a trail more legend than fact, he strikes out towards Saqqara, just south of the pyramids. But once there, he finds nothing but broken stone blocks and sand.
The necropolis at Saqqara is a spectacle of desolation. Walls of broken brick, mounds of sand mixed with stone. Here and there, the bandages of mummies blown by the wind, and human bones bleached by the sun.
setting up camp in the middle of the ancient cemetery, Mariette is desperate to make a discovery that will redeem him in the eyes of France.
While trying to make out the original plan of the tombs, my eyes fell upon a sphinx, its smiling head sticking out of the sand. I recognized it to be one from the avenue of sphinxes I had heard about. Without doubt, precious remains and unknown texts lay beneath these sands, so I assembled about 30 workmen around the sphinx, a discovery that would completely transform my life.
Within days, a double row of sphinxes emerges from the sand to once again bask in the desert sun. The anticipation is almost unbearable, and expectations are high. Mariette knows that at one end of this ancient street lies a fabled labyrinth of tombs known as the Serapeum. After 3 months, an entire avenue flanked by 141 sphinxes marked the way to the Serapeum's elaborate entrance. Dedicated to Apis, the god of fertility and resurrection, who takes the form of a bull, the Serapeum is a combination tomb and temple, dating from an early period of Egyptian history, about which virtually nothing is known. On November 12, 1851, Auguste Mariette breaks through the accumulated pile of rubble and enters cautiously an immense underground passageway. On either side are chambers containing enormous sarcophagi that once held the mummified bodies of sacred bulls. As sites of sacred worship, the chambers are crammed with thousands of magnificent objects, statuary, jewels, bronze tablets, riches of every sort. One of the sarcophagi is still intact. Determined to get at its treasure, Mariette buries dynamite under one corner of the stone lid, lights the fuse with his cigar, and runs. The mummified body of the only remaining Apis bull is obliterated. As word of his discovery spreads, Mariette finds himself at the center of a political firestorm. European antique dealers and rival Egyptologists condemn him. Finally, realizing the true value of their heritage, the Egyptian government and local officials accuse him of theft and the destruction of antiquities. Undaunted, Mariette continues to remove the Serapeum's treasure and rebury it in the desert to prevent his rivals, legal and otherwise, from finding it. Finally, the French government and the Louvre strike a deal with Egyptian authorities. The two nations will divide the treasure. By the time the excavation is finished, over 230 crates of priceless treasure have been shipped to the Louvre. But notably, an equal number remain in Egypt. After nearly 4 years in Egypt, Mariette returns to Paris to a hero's welcome and an appointment as curator of Egyptology at the Louvre. But he finds himself obsessed with the desert and the thrill of discovery. He writes,
"My work at the Serapeum made it impossible for me to pursue a purely academic career. I knew I would die or go mad if I did not return to Egypt immediately."
After less than a year in Paris, Mariette returns to Egypt at the insistence of the Turkish viceroy. In a curious turn of events, the man so recently accused of theft is to be appointed the first director of the new Egyptian Antiquities Service. Mariette approaches his new position with the zeal of the converted. Given full power to license and police all excavation work, Mariette begins to view treasure hunting as illegal and immoral. England, Italy and Germany are outraged. The great colonial powers see Egypt as little more than an endless source of trophies, and consider Mariette's appointment as head of the Antiquities a sweetheart deal between the Egyptian and French governments. Undoubtedly, there's reason for the outcry. The majority of archaeologists working in Egypt at the time are English, and the Turks who rule Egypt are political allies of Germany. Mariette's first chance to exercise his new powers comes in February 1859, when a crew of Egyptian workmen discover the tomb of Queen Aotep near the ancient burial grounds at Thebes. When reports filter in that local officials are shipping the treasure to the Turkish viceroy, Mariette sails towards Thebes, where he confronts a boat laden with tomb finds. Mariette confiscates the treasure and has it sent to Cairo, thwarting the viceroy, the very man who gave him his job. Anxious to get back into the field himself, Mariette soon mounts an expedition to the temple of Amun at Karnak. Keen to set a good example, Mariette begins employing dating methods developed by German Egyptologist Karl Lepsius. Known as stratigraphy, the dates of buried objects are determined by comparing their relative depths. Using the latest techniques, Mariette insists on photographing every object before removing it from the ground. Photography now becomes an essential tool to accurately record finds.
Only after a long examination can an archaeologist make distinctions between works of art. Photography recognizes these instantly and with the greatest of impartiality. Photography never lies. You are sure of its complete objectivity. You see exactly what it sees.
In 1860 alone, Mariette sets up 35 new excavation sites. But he remains anxious to return to Saqqara, where he had first discovered the treasures of the Serapeum. He feels certain the site still holds even greater discoveries. Once again, his instincts don't fail him. Returning to Saqqara, he unearths a series of tombs containing a magnificent cache of 4,000-year-old wooden funerary statues, with paint so fresh that the workmen who discover them flee in terror, thinking they have uncovered living people who've lain buried for thousands of years. With these latest discoveries, Mariette becomes a pioneer in the study of Egypt's Old Kingdom, an era that ended nearly 4,000 years ago. Every surface of the funerary chambers is brilliantly decorated with scenes of everyday life. People hunting and fishing, at work and at play. Mariette realizes that these scenes were meant to surround the dead with familiar scenes from their earthly lives and comfort them on their journey to the next world. They would have been important discoveries in any tomb, but this was the tomb of Khephren, one of the greatest pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, and builder of the second of the three great pyramids at Giza. The magnificence of these tombs brings home to Mariette the importance of protecting Egypt's monuments. Their great age makes them extremely fragile. Once uncovered, they quickly begin to deteriorate. Air, moisture, and sunlight all taking their toll. But worst of all is human interference. In the decades since he opened the first tomb at Saqqara, it had suffered more at the hands of tourists and archaeologists than it had in the previous 6,000 years. Mariette vows to do everything possible to protect these early remnants of human civilization. He writes,
500 years hence, Egypt should still be able to show the scholar who will visit her the same monuments we are now describing.
To combat the threat of deterioration, as well as the illegal trade in stolen antiquities, Mariette presses the Egyptian government for funds to set up a museum in Cairo. Successful in his efforts, Egypt's first museum of ancient Egyptian artifacts opens in 1863.
Once upon a time, Egypt destroyed its monuments. Today she respects them, and in the future, she will love them.
Ironic words from a man who once used dynamite to open a sarcophagus. Yet they show what a profound effect the ancient land of the pharaohs is having on the ambitious young Frenchman. In 1867, Mariette returns to Paris long enough to oversee the installation of the Egyptian exhibit at the World Fair. The French academic community is effusive in their praise for the man and his work. He has single-handedly ensured that France remains the world's leader in Egyptian studies. On returning to Egypt, Mariette finds yet another opportunity to impress the world. The greatest engineering marvel of the age, the French-built Suez Canal, will open in 2 years, and the Viceroy puts Mariette in charge of the opening celebrations. Central to the festivities, Mariette envisions a great opera celebrating the glories of ancient Egypt. Hiring the composer Giuseppe Verdi to write the score, Mariette personally outlines the story and designs the sets and costumes for the work which he names Aida. Unfortunately, the great opera is not ready when the canal opens, and does not debut until 3 years later, in 1871. Tragically, Aida is to be the last milestone in Mariette's life. In 1878, his museum is ravaged by floods, and most of his notes and drawings are destroyed. By the spring of 1881, prematurely aged by the demands of his work, grief-stricken at the loss of his notes, and nearly blind, the 6-year-old Mariette knows he must find a replacement. But rather than select one of the many archaeologists working in Egypt, most of whom are British, he appoints a little-known French academic. Although hardly an obvious choice for the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, to Mariette this is the best way to maintain French supremacy in Egypt. Mariette's candidate is Gaston Maspero. Although a brilliant young linguist in the tradition of Champollion, Maspero's knowledge of archaeology is limited at best. Within weeks of his appointment, Maspero, who has never been to Egypt, finds himself charged with the monumental job of preserving the world's most important archaeological sites. a job that has become so complex that no one man, regardless of his skills, can possibly handle it. Aware of his lack of experience, Maspero decides prudently to begin by continuing Mariette's work at Saqqara, but expand its scope. Mariette had concentrated on the early tombs, ignoring the many later tombs lying nearby. Focusing on these, Maspero searches for tombs with fully developed hieroglyphic inscriptions. In this way, he hopes to trace the development of the Egyptian language, from simple pictures to fully developed hieroglyphs, and so tie together the early and late Egyptian civilizations to form an unbroken map of Egyptian culture. Selecting 5 pyramids from the later period of the Old Kingdom, Maspero's assumption pays off. The tombs contain over 4,000 lines of hieroglyphs. After more than 5,000 years, the writing is still clearly decipherable. Maspero orders that it all be sketched and photographed. The inscriptions are so numerous and so complex that Maspero knows it will take years to complete their translation. But the results of the work should piece together a chronology of Egyptian history and help bring academic discipline to the haphazard study of ancient Egypt. But academic discipline is not the greatest challenge facing Maspero. It is controlling the trade in stolen antiquities. Egypt in the 1880s remains rife with looters, corrupt officials, and black market antiquities dealers. One of the most notorious collectors is Sir Wallace Budge, curator of Egyptian antiquities for the British Museum. On his frequent trips to Egypt, Budge acquires huge amounts of treasure, most of it finding its way back to England without proper authorization. It is Budge's way of circumventing French control of Egyptian art. The national rivalry which had kept England and France at war from the Middle Ages through to the fall of Napoleon only 65 years earlier is now being played out as a game of cultural warfare. Knowing that Budge is dealing in massive quantities of stolen artifacts, Maspero surrounds his house in Cairo with armed guards. Budge, in response, orders his gardener to dig a tunnel from his house to the hotel next door, and has his treasure moved through the hotel's service entrance. Maspero is furious. To complicate matters, advances in steamship and rail transport bring to Egypt a rising tide of rich tourists, anxious to take home a little bit of ancient history. They rarely ask where their souvenirs come from, most not even realizing they're buying original artifacts. Determined to stop the flow of black market antiques, Maspero mounts a full-scale investigation to trace the cultural hemorrhage to its source. The finger of suspicion points directly at 3 brothers from the village of Gourna, known since the 14th century as a haven for tomb robbers. Maspero orders their arrest. After nearly a month of continuous interrogation, the brothers reveal nothing. Finally, when 2 are released, and the 3rd is confronted with a pile of stolen loot, he breaks down, revealing the entire operation and the location of the treasure hoard. Following the thief's directions, Maspero's team of investigators rush to a long-forgotten temple near Thebes. Almost 200 feet up the side of a steep cliff, the men find a concealed entrance to a cave. Scrambling to remove the dirt and stones covering its mouth, the team enters a long sloping tunnel. Making their way to the end of the shaft, the men discover a scene rivaling Aladdin's cave. Maspero writes in his official report,
"It was incredible. Where I'd been expecting to find 2 or 3 insignificant kings, we uncovered a whole vault of pharaohs. And what pharaohs? The most famous to have ever ruled Egypt, the conquerors of Syria and Ethiopia. Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramses II. Egypt is truly a land of wonders. Unlike other ancient cultures, she is not just content with handing us her monuments, she gives us the very man who erected them."
Centuries ago, priests had moved the bodies of these once mighty monarchs from their original burial vaults to this inaccessible cave. They had hoped that this would save the pharaohs and their treasure from the ravages of ancient tomb robbers. Ironically, it is the work of modern thieves that brings them and their treasures to light. Maspero orders the royal cache and its contents moved to Cairo as quickly as possible.
That evening in Luxor, mummies, coffins and other goods were duly wrapped in sheets and taken to the boat. As we left with our cargo of kings, a curious thing occurred. On both banks of the Nile, peasant women followed the boat wailing, and the men fired off their rifles, as if honoring a funeral.
In 1886, after 5 years of continual success, Maspero begins the monumental job of uncovering one of the great symbols of Egyptian civilization, the giant Sphinx at Giza. Buried to its neck in the shifting sands for untold centuries, its actual size had long been a matter of speculation. Maspero's excavation team sets to work, and after 3 months, the body of the huge beast begins to emerge. By the time the work is finished, the level of the sand has been lowered more than 65 feet. But Maspero's plan is to do more than just expose the great statue. He wants to know if there are tombs beneath it. Although he never finds any, we now know that they do exist, buried deep beneath the huge paws of the creature. Curiously, the Egyptian government has never allowed them to be excavated. Maspero's impressive catalogue of work, especially the uncovering of the Sphinx, is attracting an increasing number of European and American tourists. Maspero decides to charge admission to the monuments and excavations. If people are going to enjoy Egypt, they should help pay for its study and preservation. Within months of clearing the Sphinx, Maspero returns to France to resume his academic career and write up his work. It was a hiatus that was to last 13 years. In his absence, techniques in archaeological fieldwork continue to develop, and Maspero is hard-pressed to keep abreast of developments. Finally, in 1898, at the age of 53, Gaston Maspero returns to his beloved Egypt. No sooner has he returned than disaster hits. On October 3rd, 1889, an earthquake strikes the great temple at Karnak, collapsing 11 columns and leaving the main hall in ruins. Determined to repair the building, Maspero assigns a team of workmen, led by the best French archaeologists, to begin the massive job of reconstruction. Maspero visits the site often to monitor the progress of the work. He's mesmerized at the sight of a 4,000-year-old building under construction.
Much earth had to be cleared to find the huge stones, some of them 20 meters in height, which had buried themselves in the sand when they collapsed. Blocks were laid on rollers of acacia wood and pulled into place with great cords. If Ramses II had come back to inspect the work, he could quite well have imagined that nothing in his country had changed.
Although done to the best standards of the time, the reconstruction work provokes international debate. Everyone in the world seems to have an opinion on what to do with the damaged building. Romantic poets and painters demand that the ruins be left as they had fallen, but Maspero and most Egyptologists disagree.
It is always a pity to meddle with such beautiful ruins, even when necessity demands it, but how could we have done any other? Time urges us to revive the monuments without doing anything to alter their character, and to investigate work which might preserve them.
As if reconstruction of the temple is not impressive enough, discoveries made during the restoration nearly overshadow the work itself. In 1903, during the 4th year of restoration, an enormous alabaster floor is unearthed in the court of the 7th pylon. When workmen raise the massive stone, they uncover a shaft descending deep into the desert. At its bottom they find an unimaginable hoard of statuary. Maspero writes,
"For 20 months now we've been fishing things out of the Karnak temple. Statues, busts, mutilated trunks, bodies without heads, enthroned pharaohs, queens and priests, caught in the very moment of their lives, professions and ranks. An entire people ascending into the light."
Every step is carefully recorded, drawn and photographed using the best archaeological methods to date. By the time the project is completed, almost 17,000 pieces of Egyptian art have come to light. It marks an immense step forward in understanding the world of ancient Egypt. The scope of the project, combined with running the museum and every archaeological site in Egypt, has become more than Maspero can handle. The staff of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities has to be expanded. Among those hired is an inexperienced 17-year-old Englishman named Howard Carter. He's destined to find international fame a quarter century later as the discoverer of the fabulous tomb of Tutankhamun. But even with a greatly enlarged staff, Maspero still has to fight the biggest battles alone. To encourage the Egyptian people to take greater responsibility for their own past, he sets up a chain of local museums throughout Egypt, including a new, larger facility in Cairo. Maspero is convinced that increased public awareness will play an essential part in protecting Egypt's treasures. Then in 1912 he achieves what his predecessors had been fighting for over 60 years. The introduction of a series of laws prohibiting the pillage of Egyptian antiquities and monuments. Gaston Maspero retires in 1914, his achievements have made a profound impact on Egypt. But it was the work of others that pushed the science of Egyptology forward. Even before Maspero took charge of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities in 1880, a 27-year-old Englishman named William Flinders Petrie arrives in the desert on a mission that at the time seemed strange. Petrie wants to make a detailed study of the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza. To local Egyptians, and even other Egyptologists, it seems a senseless undertaking. To Petrie, it makes perfect sense. In the 80 years since Europeans began studying Egypt, no one has ever considered how these massive structures had been erected. While still in his teens, Petrie had traveled around England's megalithic ruins to study and measure them, in an attempt to work out their complex geometry. At 19, he makes a comprehensive study of the arrangement of Stonehenge. Following on from his experiences at Stonehenge, it seems only natural to study the geometry of other ancient structures. He reads numerous theories on the construction of the pyramids, but none are based on first-hand observations, or even seemingly on logic. English astronomer Piazzi Smith proposes that each row of stones symbolizes the upward progress of civilization. Other theories seem just as misguided and wild. The best way to find out the truth is to visit Egypt. As Petrie wanders among the pyramids and monuments, measuring and making calculations, he, like others before him, is appalled at the rate at which the Egyptian heritage is being plundered and defiled. Entire sections of buildings and temples have been torn away. Some monuments listed in travel guides have vanished altogether. While European collectors are carting off their treasure, the Egyptians are burning thousands of ancient mummies as fuel for train and steamship engines. Like other travelers, Petrie often heard an engineer cry, "We need more steam. Throw a pharaoh on the fire."
A year's work in Egypt made me feel it was a house on fire, so rapid was the destruction. My duty was that of a salvage man, to get all I could as quickly as possible, and then when I was 60, I would sit and write it all down.
In 1880, after a year of touring, measuring and collecting, Petrie returns to London to write up his finds. After publishing a number of articles, he meets journalist Amelia Edwards, founder of the Egyptian Exploration Fund, a group of wealthy benefactors interested in popularizing Egyptian culture. Impressed by his scientific approach, Petrie receives backing to return to Egypt to continue his work. On his return, Petrie travels to Tanis in the Nile Delta, where he makes a detailed study of a temple from the period of the New Kingdom.
Excavation in Egypt fascinates me, and I hope that the results may justify the enterprise. I believe the true line of research lies in the careful noting and comparison of the smallest details.
Petrie introduces innovative methods of excavation. He eliminates the position of foreman, taking complete control of the digs himself.
At Talis, I had 170 workmen under my command, who worked without being pressured by the foreman.
Many experienced Egyptologists consider Petrie an amateur and a dilettante, but his methods are popular among his workers, and they produce a number of small but significant finds. At the end of the dig, Petrie is out of cash, but reluctant to leave Egypt in case his funding is renewed, he spends 1887 cruising the Nile with a friend. During the trip, Petrie, like other forward-looking archaeologists, takes hundreds of photographs because they provide a more accurate and subjective record than sketches or engravings. South of Aswan, at the island of Sahel, he finds hundreds of inscriptions chiseled into an ancient cliff face. Some of the carvings are as old as Egyptian civilization itself. Some record the journeys of Egyptian ambassadors to the land of Nubia. Others chronicle military campaigns carried out by pharaohs. One inscription recounts a great famine and tells how King Djoser appealed to the gods to feed his people. Determined to capture these inscriptions, Petrie and his companion climb the face of the cliff on rope ladders to photograph, draw, and trace the remarkable carvings. By the time he reaches Aswan, Petrie finds a telegram guaranteeing additional money from the Egypt Exploration Fund. Without hesitation, he heads for the oasis at Fayum. Here, Petrie finds scores of burial mounds and pyramids built over the course of more than 4,000 years. The most recent were built only a century or so after the time of Jesus. Although the exterior stones had long since been pilfered, Petrie hopes to find the burial chambers still intact. It is the late period tombs that interest Petrie the most. Little is known about life in Egypt in the centuries after the death of its last ruler, Cleopatra. Inside the tombs, Petrie discovers a cache of 60 magnificent wax funerary portraits painted on wooden panels. By deciphering the writing on the sarcophagi, Petrie discovers that Egyptians from the Roman period kept the bodies of dead relatives amongst the family for several generations before moving them into the tombs, a startling revelation. According to the laws previously established by Ulrich Mariette, all archaeological finds must be shared equally with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. Dutifully, Petrie sends the delicate wax images to Cairo. Later he discovers to his disgust that Gaston Maspero has dumped the magnificent artwork behind the museum to lie in the sun and rain. Furious, Petrie demands the priceless antiquities be returned before they are completely destroyed. Finally, Maspero selects 12 portraits for the museum in Cairo, leaving Petrie with 48 of the extraordinary masks, which he sends to London for a special showing at the British Museum. Petrie resumes work at Fayum, he discovers the remains of a 4,000-year-old village used by the workmen employed to build the pharaoh's tombs. The houses are filled with common utensils of everyday life. Here is an aspect of life in ancient Egypt that has been completely overlooked: the everyday objects of everyday people.
We found papyri, implements for weaving, tools made out of wood and flint, pots, toys of dried mud, clothes, and leather sandals.
The objects are not as grand as those from a pharaoh's tomb, but they are things that people everywhere in the world can understand and connect with. Each item is removed from the ground with Petrie's customary insistence on accurately recording its position. This remarkable discovery gives Petrie an international reputation as an archaeologist of note. From the mountain of data produced by his excavations, Petrie is determined to publish his findings for the benefit of future generations. A prolific writer, Petrie would publish a total of 97 books.
I am only concerned that publication of my work over the decades and centuries to come will serve as an invaluable reference on their subject.
With his work at Fayum finished, Petrie turns to the palace of Akhenaton at Tel el Armana in central Egypt. Although Akhenaton and his beautiful wife Nefertiti are among Egypt's most famous rulers, little is known of their palace or lifestyle. Petrie is determined to change that. Beginning in 1891, he systematically excavates and examines the remains of the 3,500-year-old complex. Early in the work, a magnificent painted pavement is discovered. Almost 300 foot square, the floor is a masterpiece of New Kingdom art. Lotus flower borders encircle a painted garden, complete with a garden path and lake surrounded by animal life. The discovery instantly becomes a major tourist attraction in Egypt. But because there is no direct access to the site, visitors carelessly trample through the fields on their way to Tel el Armana. In protest, angry farmers crept up to the site and hammered the magnificent floor to pieces. Only thanks to Petrie's photographs and detailed drawings would future generations be able to appreciate the beauty of the pavement. As time passes, Petrie becomes more and more curious about the origins of Egyptian civilization. Mariette's work at Saqqara has helped unravel the secrets of the Old Kingdom, and Maspero has established a timeline for the development of the Egyptian language. But what existed before the time of the pharaohs?
After having immersed myself in each of the great periods of Egypt, I was impatient to discover how it all began.
Petrie begins his search on the west bank of the Nile, north of Luxor. Here he uncovers a vast necropolis with thousands of tombs from an unknown period in Egyptian history. The cemetery is so vast, the digs so extensive, that Petrie is forced to devise an entirely new system of excavation and classification. In order to make sense of the mountain of finds, Petrie develops a simple comparison chart in which he records each artifact by style, shape, and decoration. Petrie's charts are still used by modern archaeologists and paleontologists. Now nearly 75, Petrie's sheer capacity for work continually amazes his colleagues, even those half his age. Exhausting as it is, Petrie still loves his work.
I am at peace in this land. Such an impression of freshness is at the heart of its existence.
In 1933, Flinders Petrie, the boy who set out to measure the pyramids, retires from University College and moves to Jerusalem. He dies there 9 years later, while working at the age of 89. In little more than a century, Egyptology was transformed from a sport for gentlemen adventurers and tomb raiders to an exacting science dedicated to the study and preservation of ancient Egypt for all time and all people. It now lies with the Egyptologists of the 20th century to ensure that the labor and vision of the early pioneers do not go to waste. The national rivalry which had kept England and France at war from the Middle Ages through to the fall of Napoleon only 65 years earlier is now being played out as a game of cultural warfare. Knowing that Budge is dealing in massive quantities of stolen artifacts, Maspero surrounds his house in Cairo with armed guards. Budge, in response, orders his gardener to dig a tunnel from his house to the hotel next door, and has his treasure moved through the hotel's service entrance. Maspero is furious. To complicate matters, advances in steamship and rail transport bring to Egypt a rising tide of rich tourists, anxious to take home a little bit of ancient history. They rarely ask where their souvenirs come from, most not even realizing they're buying original artifacts. Determined to stop the flow of black market antiques, Maspero mounts a full-scale investigation to trace the cultural hemorrhage to its source. The finger of suspicion points directly at three brothers from the village of Gurna, known since the 14th century as a haven for tomb robbers. Maspero orders their arrest. After nearly a month of continuous interrogation, the brothers reveal nothing. Finally, when two are released, and the third is confronted with a pile of stolen loot, he breaks down, revealing the entire operation and the location of the treasure hoard. Following the thief's directions, Maspero's team of investigators rush to a long-forgotten temple near Thebes. Almost 200 feet up the side of a steep cliff, the men find a concealed entrance to a cave. Scrambling to remove the dirt and stones covering its mouth, the team enters a long sloping tunnel. Making their way to the end of the shaft, the men discover a scene rivaling Aladdin's cave. Maspero writes in his official report,
"It was incredible. Where I'd been expecting to find 2 or 3 insignificant kings, we uncovered a whole vault of pharaohs, And what pharaohs! The most famous to have ever ruled Egypt, the conquerors of Syria and Ethiopia.
As illegal and immoral. England, Italy and Germany are outraged. The great colonial powers see Egypt as little more than an endless source of trophies, and consider Mariette's appointment as head of the Antiquities a sweetheart deal between the Egyptian and French governments. Undoubtedly, there's reason for the outcry. The majority of archaeologists working in Egypt at the time are English, and the Turks who rule Egypt are political allies of Germany. Mariette's first chance to exercise his new powers comes in February 1859, when a crew of Egyptian workmen discover the tomb of Queen Aotep near the ancient burial grounds at Thebes. When reports filter in that local officials are shipping the treasure to the Turkish viceroy, Mariette sails towards Thebes, where he confronts a boat laden with tomb finds. Mariette confiscates the treasure and has it sent to Cairo, thwarting the viceroy, the very man who gave him his job. Anxious to get back into the field himself, Mariette soon mounts an expedition to the temple of Amun at Karnak. Keen to set a good example, Mariette begins employing dating methods developed by German Egyptologist Karl Lepsius. Known as stratigraphy, the dates of buried objects are determined by comparing their relative depths. Using the latest techniques, Mariette insists on photographing every object before removing it from the ground. Photography now becomes an essential tool to accurately record finds.
Only after a long examination can an archaeologist make distinctions between works of art. Photography recognizes these instantly and with the greatest of impartiality. Photography never lies. You are sure of its complete objectivity. You see exactly what it sees.
In 1860 alone, Mariette sets up 35 new excavations, but none are based on first-hand observations, or even seemingly on logic. English astronomer Piazzi Smith proposes that each row of stones symbolizes the upward progress of civilization. Other theories seem just as misguided and wild. The best way to find out the truth is to visit Egypt. As Petrie wanders among the pyramids and monuments, measuring and making calculations, he, like others before him, is appalled at the rate at which the Egyptian heritage is being plundered and defiled. Entire sections of buildings and temples have been torn away. Some monuments listed in travel guides have vanished altogether. While European collectors are carting off their treasure, the Egyptians are burning thousands of ancient mummies as fuel for train and steamship engines. Like other travelers, Petrie often heard an engineer cry, "We need more steam. Throw a pharaoh on the fire."
A year's work in Egypt made me feel it was a house on fire, so rapid was the destruction. My duty was that of a salvage man, to get all I could as quickly as possible, and then when I was 60, I would sit and write it all down.
In 1880, after a year of touring, measuring and collecting, Petrie returns to London to write up his finds. After publishing a number of articles, he meets journalist Amelia Edwards, founder of the Egyptian Exploration Fund, a group of wealthy benefactors interested in popularizing Egyptian culture. Impressed by his scientific approach, Petrie receives backing to return to Egypt to continue his work. On his return, Petrie travels to Tanis in the Nile Delta, where he makes a detailed study of a temple from the period of the New Kingdom.
Excavation in Egypt fascinates me, and I hope that the results may justify the enterprise. I believe the true line of research lies in the careful noting and comparison of the smallest details.
Of statuary. Maspero writes,
"For 20 months now we've been fishing things out of the Karnak temple. Statues, busts, mutilated trunks, bodies without heads, enthroned pharaohs, queens and priests caught in the very moment of their lives, professions and ranks. An entire people ascending into the light."
Every step is carefully recorded, drawn and photographed using the best archaeological methods to date. By the time the project is completed, almost 17,000 pieces of Egyptian art have come to light. It marks an immense step forward in understanding the world of ancient Egypt. The scope of the project, combined with running the museum and every archaeological site in Egypt, has become more than Maspero can handle. The staff of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities has to be expanded. Among those hired is an inexperienced 17-year-old Englishman named Howard Carter. He's destined to find international fame a quarter century later as the discoverer of the fabulous tomb of Tutankhamun. But even with a greatly enlarged staff, Maspero still has to fight the biggest battles alone. To encourage the Egyptian people to take greater responsibility for their own past, he sets up a chain of local museums throughout Egypt, including a new, larger facility in Cairo. Maspero is convinced that increased public awareness will play an essential part in protecting Egypt's treasures. Then in 1912 he achieves what his predecessors had been fighting for over 60 years. The introduction of a series of laws prohibiting the pillage of Egyptian antiquities and monuments. When Gaston Maspero retires in 1914, his achievements have made a profound impact on Egypt. But it was the work of others that pushed the science of Egyptology forward. Even before Maspero took charge of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities in 1880, a 27-year-old Englishman moved to Cairo as quickly as possible.
That evening in Luxor, mummies, coffins and other goods were duly wrapped in sheets and taken to the boat. As we left with our cargo of kings, a curious thing occurred. On both banks of the Nile, peasant women followed the boat wailing, and the men fired off their rifles, as if honoring a funeral.
In 1886, after 5 years of continual success, Maspero begins the monumental job of uncovering one of the great symbols of Egyptian civilization, the giant Sphinx at Giza. Buried to its neck in the shifting sands for untold centuries, its actual size had long been a matter of speculation. Maspro's excavation team sets to work, and after 3 months, the body of the huge beast begins to emerge. By the time the work is finished, the level of the sand has been lowered more than 65 feet. But Maspro's plan is to do more than just expose the great statue. He wants to know if there are tombs beneath it. Although he never finds any, we now know that they do exist, buried deep beneath the huge paws of the creature. Curiously, the Egyptian government has never allowed them to be excavated. Maspro's impressive catalogue of work, especially the uncovering of the Sphinx, is attracting an increasing number of European and American tourists. Maspro decides to charge admission to the monuments and excavations. If people are going to enjoy Egypt, they should help pay for its study and preservation. Within months of clearing the Sphinx, Maspro returns to France to resume his academic career and write up his work. It was a hiatus that was to last 13 years. In his absence, techniques in archaeological fieldwork continue to develop, and Maspro is hard-pressed to keep abreast of developments. Finally, in 1898, at the age of 53, Gaston Maspero returns to his beloved Egypt. No sooner has he returned, a cache of 60 magnificent wax funerary portraits painted on wooden panels. By deciphering the writing on the sarcophagi, Petrie discovers that Egyptians from the Roman period kept the bodies of dead relatives amongst the family for several generations before moving them into the tombs, a startling revelation. According to the laws previously established by Ulrich Mariette, all archaeological finds must be shared equally with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. Dutifully, Petrie sends the delicate wax images to Cairo. Later he discovers to his disgust that Gaston Maspero has dumped the magnificent artwork behind the museum to lie in the sun and rain. Furious, Petrie demands the priceless antiquities be returned before they are completely destroyed. Finally, Maspero selects 12 portraits for the museum in Cairo, leaving Petrie with 48 of the extraordinary masks, which he sends to London for a special showing at the British Museum. When Petrie resumes work at Fayum, he discovers the remains of a 4,000-year-old village used by the workmen employed to build the pharaoh's tombs. The houses are filled with common utensils of everyday life. Here is an aspect of life in ancient Egypt that has been completely overlooked: the everyday objects of everyday people.
We found papyri, implements for weaving, tools made out of wood and flint, pots, toys of dried mud, clothes, and leather sandals.
The objects are not as grand as those from a pharaoh's tomb, but they are things that people everywhere in the world can understand and connect with. Each item is removed from the ground with Petrie's customary insistence on accurately recording its position. This remarkable discovery gives Petrie an international reputation as an archaeologist of note. From the mountain of data produced by his excavations, Petrie is determined to publish his findings for the benefit of future generations. Auguste Mariette. Largely self-taught, Mariette's dedication to his work quickly earns him the attention of his superiors. After only 3 years, he's picked for a mission to Cairo. His task to acquire a number of ancient manuscripts, ensuring France retains the finest Egyptian collection in the world. Acquiring Egyptian artifacts is a competitive business, engaged in by both rival museums and private collectors. The English are richer than the French, the Italians more ruthless, and the Germans more ambitious. Egyptology in the mid-19th century is a dangerous occupation, fraught with subterfuge, double-dealing, and outright theft. Mariette falls in love with Egypt, but his inexperience allows the precious manuscripts to slip through his fingers. He's convinced that his failure will embarrass the Louvre and cost him his job. But as he stares out towards the desert and the distant pyramids, he writes in his journal,
"The peaceful city stretched before me with the pyramids standing to the west. I was utterly absorbed. There, almost within reach of my hand, lay a whole world of tombs, inscriptions, and statues."
Determined to make the best use of what might be his only trip to Egypt, Mariette decides to visit the pyramids and a few temples before his money runs out. During his travels, he befriends a Bedouin tribe who tell fantastic stories of fabulous treasures, ancient tombs, and lost cities still buried under the desert sand. If he can prove that even one of these stories is true, Mariette is convinced he might still return to France a hero. Following a trail more legend than fact, he strikes out towards Saqqara, just south of the pyramids. But once there, he finds nothing but broken stone blocks and sand.
The necropolis at Saqqara is a spectacle of desolation. Walls of broken brick, mounds of sand mixed with stone. Here and there, the bandages of mummies blown by the wind, and human bones bleached by the sun.
Setting up camp in the middle of the ancient cemetery, Mariette is desperate to make a discovery that will redeem him in the eyes of France. In 1847, the Louvre's Egyptian department gains its newest employee, 26-year-old Auguste Mariette. Largely self-taught, Mariette's dedication to his work quickly earns him the attention of his superiors. After only 3 years, he's picked for a mission to Cairo. His task to acquire a number of ancient manuscripts, ensuring France retains the finest Egyptian collection in the world. Acquiring Egyptian artifacts is a competitive business, engaged in by both rival museums and private collectors. The English are richer than the French, the Italians more ruthless, and the Germans more ambitious. Egyptology in the mid-19th century is a dangerous occupation, fraught with subterfuge, double-dealing, and outright theft. Mariette falls in love with Egypt, but his inexperience allows the precious manuscripts to slip through his fingers. He's convinced that his failure will embarrass the Louvre and cost him his job. But as he stares out towards the desert and the distant pyramids, he writes in his journal,
"The peaceful city stretched before me with the pyramids standing to the west. I was utterly absorbed. There, almost within reach of my hand, lay a whole world of tombs, inscriptions, and statues."
Determined to make the best use of what might be his only trip to Egypt, Mariette decides to visit the pyramids and a few temples before his money runs out. During his travels, he befriends a Bedouin tribe who tell fantastic stories of fabulous treasures, ancient tombs and lost cities still buried under the desert sand. If he can prove that even one of these stories is true, Mariette is convinced he might still return to France a hero. Following a trail more legend than fact, he strikes out towards Saqqara, just south of the pyramids. But once there, he finds nothing but broken stone blocks and sand.
The necropolis at Saqqara is a spectacle of desolation. Walls of broken brick, mounds of sand mixed with stone. Here and there, the bandages of mummies blown by the wind, and human bones bleached by the sun.
Setting up camp in the middle of the ancient some record the journeys of Egyptian ambassadors to the land of Nubia. Others chronicle military campaigns carried out by pharaohs. One inscription recounts a great famine and tells how King Djoser appealed to the gods to feed his people. Determined to capture these inscriptions, Petrie and his companion climb the face of the cliff on rope ladders to photograph, draw, and trace the remarkable carvings. By the time he reaches Aswan, Petrie finds a telegram guaranteeing additional money from the Egypt Exploration Fund. Without hesitation, he heads for the oasis at Fayum. Here, Petrie finds scores of burial mounds and pyramids built over the course of more than 4,000 years. The most recent were built only a century or so after the time of Jesus. Although the exterior stones had long since been pilfered, Petrie hopes to find the burial chambers still intact. It is the late period tombs that interest Petrie the most. Little is known about life in Egypt in the centuries after the death of its last ruler, Cleopatra. Inside the tombs, Petrie discovers a cache of 60 magnificent wax funerary portraits painted on wooden panels. By deciphering the writing on the sarcophagi, Petrie discovers that Egyptians from the Roman period kept the bodies of dead relatives amongst the family for several generations before moving them into the tombs, a startling revelation. According to the laws previously established by Ulrich Mariette, all archaeological finds must be shared equally with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. Dutifully, Petrie sends the delicate wax images to Cairo. Later he discovers to his disgust that Gaston Maspero has dumped the magnificent artwork behind the museum to lie in the sun and rain. Furious, Petrie demands that it is being plundered and defiled. Entire sections of buildings and temples have been torn away. Some monuments listed in travel guides have vanished altogether. While European collectors are carting off their treasure, the Egyptians are burning thousands of ancient mummies as fuel for train and steamship engines. Like other travelers, Petrie often heard an engineer cry, "We need more steam. Throw a pharaoh on the fire."
A year's work in Egypt made me feel it was a house on fire, so rapid was the destruction. My duty was that of a salvage man, to get all I could as quickly as possible, and then when I was 60, I would sit and write it all down.
In 1880, after a year of touring, measuring and collecting, Petrie returns to London to write up his finds. After publishing a number of articles, he meets journalist Amelia Edwards, founder of the Egyptian Exploration Fund, a group of wealthy benefactors interested in popularizing Egyptian culture. Impressed by his scientific approach, Petrie receives backing to return to Egypt to continue his work. On his return, Petrie travels to Tanis in the Nile Delta, where he makes a detailed study of a temple from the period of the New Kingdom.
Excavation in Egypt fascinates me, and I hope that the results may justify the enterprise. I believe the true line of research lies in the careful noting and comparison of the smallest details.
Petrie introduces innovative methods of excavation. He eliminates the position of foreman, taking complete control of the digs himself.
At Tanis, I had 170 workmen under my command, who worked without being pressured by the foreman.
Many experienced Egyptologists consider Petrie an amateur and a dilettante, but his methods are popular among his workers, and they produce a number of small but significant finds. At the end of the day, some record the journeys of Egyptian ambassadors to the land of Nubia. Others chronicle military campaigns carried out by pharaohs. One inscription recounts a great famine and tells how King Djoser appealed to the gods to feed his people. Determined to capture these inscriptions, Petrie and his companion climb the face of the cliff on rope ladders to photograph, draw, and trace the remarkable carvings. By the time he reaches Aswan, Petrie finds a telegram guaranteeing additional money from the Egypt Exploration Fund. Without hesitation, he heads for the oasis at Fayum. Here, Petrie finds scores of burial mounds and pyramids built over the course of more than 4,000 years. The most recent were built only a century or so after the time of Jesus. Although the exterior stones had long since been pilfered, Petrie hopes to find the burial chambers still intact. It is the late period tombs that interest Petrie the most. Little is known about life in Egypt in the centuries after the death of its last ruler, Cleopatra. Inside the tombs, Petrie discovers a cache of 60 magnificent wax funerary portraits painted on wooden panels. By deciphering the writing on the sarcophagi, Petrie discovers that Egyptians from the Roman period kept the bodies of dead relatives amongst the family for several generations before moving them into the tombs, a startling revelation. According to the laws previously established by Ulrich Mariette, all archaeological finds must be shared equally with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. Dutifully, Petrie sends the delicate wax images to Cairo. Later he discovers to his disgust that Gaston Maspero has dumped the magnificent artwork behind the museum to lie in the sun and rain. Furious, paid admission to the monuments and excavations. If people are going to enjoy Egypt, they should help pay for its study and preservation. Within months of clearing the Sphinx, Maspero returns to France to resume his academic career and write up his work. It was a hiatus that was to last 13 years. In his absence, techniques in archaeological fieldwork continue to develop, and Maspero is hard-pressed to keep abreast of developments. Finally, in 1898, at the age of 53, Gaston Maspero returns to his beloved Egypt. No sooner has he returned than disaster hits. On October 3rd, 1889, an earthquake strikes the great temple at Karnak, collapsing 11 columns and leaving the main hall in ruins. Determined to repair the building, Maspero assigns a team of workmen, led by the best French archaeologists, to begin the massive job of reconstruction. Maspero visits the site often to monitor the progress of the work. He's mesmerized at the sight of a 4,000-year-old building under construction.
Much earth had to be cleared to find the huge stones, some of them 20 meters in height, which had buried themselves in the sand when they collapsed. Blocks were laid on rollers of acacia wood and pulled into place with great cords. If Ramses II had come back to inspect the work, he could quite well have imagined that nothing in his country had changed.
Although done to the best standards of the time, the reconstruction work provokes international debate. Everyone in the world seems to have an opinion on what to do with the damaged building. Romantic poets and painters demand that the ruins be left as they had fallen, but Maspero and most Egyptologists disagree.
It is always a pity to meddle with such beautiful ruins, even when necessity demands it, but how could we have done any other? Time urges us to revive the monuments without doing anything to alter their